Professor Zyx'nax slithered into the classroom, his gelatinous form barely containing his excitement. Today was the day he'd finally get to showcase the universe's most terrifying species to his xenobiology students. He'd been waiting for this moment since last week when he scheduled it, but still. The classroom was filled with a cacophony of chirps, clicks, and what sounded suspiciously like a dying bagpipe. But that was just how the Glorbox communicated. As Zyx'nax oozed onto his hovering platform, the noise died down to a dull roar. "Greetings," class, he burbled enthusiastically. "Today we have a special guest lecturer. Please give a warm welcome to our resident Deathworlder, human Sarah." The class collectively gasped, a few of the more delicate species fainting on the spot. A flurbop in the front row began to dissolve in terror, but Zyx'nax paid it no mind. They always reformed eventually. Sarah strode into the room, her bipedal locomotion eliciting shrieks of horror from several students. She grinned, baring her terrifying bone daggers. "Oh wait, those were just teeth. Still pretty scary though." "Hi everyone," Sarah waved, her 5-fingered appendages causing another flurbop to lose cohesion. "I'm here to talk to you about human first aid techniques. Don't worry, I promise not to bite." Much she winked, and half the class ducked under their desks. Zyx'nax chuckled, a sound like a blender full of jello. Now, class. Human Sarah is here to educate us. Please try not to melt in fear, at least not until after the demonstration." Sarah cleared her throat, which several students mistook for a war cry. "Right, so first aid. It's how we humans help each other when we're injured or sick. It's really not that scary." A brave Synthrop raised a tentacle. "Excuse me, human Sarah, but why would you need to aid each other? Are you constantly at war?" Sarah laughed, a sound that sent shivers through the exoskeletons of half the room. No, we just get hurt sometimes. Accidents happen." The class murmured in confusion. The concept of accidents was foreign to most of them. In their perfectly ordered societies, such chaotic events were unheard of. "Okay, let's start with something simple," Sarah said, pulling out a small white box. "This is a first aid kit. It contains supplies to treat minor injuries." She opened the box, and several students screamed. One particularly high-strung Zazelblatt inflated to twice its size in sheer panic. "Calm down, it's just some bandages and antiseptic." Sarah held up a roll of gauze, which the class eyed suspiciously. "Now, let's say someone has a cut." Oh, what a horrified voice squeaked from the back. Sarah sighed. "A cut? When your skin gets separated." The class stared at her blankly. "Your outer protective layer gets damaged." More blank stares. "Oh, for the love of Professor, a little help here." Zyx'nax oozed forward. "I believe what human Sarah is referring to is a breach in the epidermal force field that most carbon-based lifeforms possess." A collective oh-hey resonated through the room, followed quickly by gasps of horror as they realized the implications. "Yes, exactly," Sarah said, relieved. "So when that happens, we clean the wound with antiseptic to prevent infection." "Infection?" The cry came from multiple students at once. The Zazelblatt that had inflated earlier now rapidly deflated, shooting around the room like a punctured balloon before collapsing in a heap. Sarah facepalmed, a gesture that caused several nearby students to flinch. "Okay, maybe we should start with something more basic. How about CPR?" The blank stares returned. "Cardiopulmonary resuscitation?" "No." "All right, it's a technique we use when someone's heart stops beating or they stop breathing." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the Glorbox had stopped their bagpipe-like wailing. Finally, a trembling voice from the front row asked, "H-heart scan. Stop." Sarah looked helplessly at Professor Zyx'nax, who was thoroughly enjoying the chaos. He gestured for her to continue, his gelatinous form quivering with barely suppressed laughter. "Right," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "Let's just show you." "I need a volunteer." The entire class recoiled as one, pressing themselves against the far wall of the classroom. Sarah could have sworn she heard whimpering. "Come on, it's perfectly safe. I promise I won't hurt anyone." A tentative tentacle raised from the middle of the huddled mass of terrified aliens. What does this volunteer have to do?" Sarah smiled encouragingly, causing another minor panic as she once again displayed her teeth. "You just need to lie down on the floor. I'll demonstrate chest compressions and rescue breathing." The owner of the tentacle, a Squidlorp named Glorp, slowly separated from the group. His 7 eyes blinked nervously as he approached Sarah, every step clearly a battle against his instinct to flee. "That's it. You're doing great," Sarah cheered. Glorp flinched at the sudden noise but continued his brave march forward. As Glorp positioned himself on the floor, Sarah knelt beside him. The class watched in horrified fascination as she placed her hands on Glorp's chest. "Okay, in a real emergency I'd start with 30 chest compressions like this." Sarah began to rhythmically press down on Glorp's chest. The poor Squidlorp's eyes widened in shock, all 7 of them spinning wildly in different directions. The class erupted into chaos. "She's killing him." "Oh, the humanity. Wait, is that the right phrase? Someone save Glorp. I'm too young to witness a murder." Professor Zyx'nax was practically vibrating with glee. This was turning out even better than he'd hoped. Sarah stopped the compressions, looking bewildered. No, I'm not hurting him. This is to help pump blood through the body if the heart stops. Glorp sat up, looking dazed but unharmed. I live. The class fell silent, staring in awe at Glorp's apparent resurrection. Sarah helped Glorp to his feet, or rather, his tentacles. See? Perfectly fine. Now let's move on to rescue breathing. Breathing, the class chorused in horror. Sarah sighed. This was going to be a long day. 3 hours later, Sarah slumped against the classroom wall, exhausted. She'd managed to demonstrate bandaging, which the class had mistaken for mummification, the Heimlich maneuver resulting in a mass panic about internal air bubbles, and the recovery position leading to a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness and sleep. Professor Zyx'nax oozed over to her, still quivering with amusement. Well, human Sarah, I must say that was the most entertaining lecture we've had in cycles. The students will be talking about this for decaphases to come. Sarah groaned. Glad someone enjoyed it. I've never seen so many beings terrified of band-aids before. The professor chuckled, a sound like a washing machine filled with pudding. Oh, don't be so hard on yourself. I think you've made quite an impression. Just look. Sarah glanced around the room. Most of the students were still huddled in groups, whispering furiously amongst themselves. But a few brave souls were cautiously approaching the first aid kit she'd left on the desk, poking at the bandages with curious tentacles, pincers, pseudopods. Glorp, the brave Squidlorp volunteer, had become something of a celebrity. He was regaling a group of wide-eyed classmates with tales of his near-death experience at the hands of the human. And then, just as I thought my final moment had come, I was miraculously revived. The human's magic hands brought me back from the brink of oblivion. Glorp's tentacles waved dramatically as he spoke. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Well, at least someone's enjoying their newfound fame. Professor Zyx'nax's form rippled in what Sarah had come to recognize as a shrug. Deathworlders like yourself are still a mystery to most of the galaxy. Human Sarah, your resilience, your ability to survive what would kill most species. It's terrifying, yes, but also fascinating. I suppose so, Sarah mused. Though I never thought I'd see the day when applying a band-aid would be considered an act of unparalleled bravery. Just then, a timid voice spoke up. A small, fuzzy creature that resembled nothing so much as a sentient dust bunny had approached them. Excuse me, human Sarah, it squeaked, but I was wondering, could you teach me more about this first aid? Sarah blinked in surprise. Really? You're not too scared? The dust bunny quivered. Whether in fear or excitement, Sarah couldn't tell. Oh, I'm terrified. But if I could learn to be even a fraction as tough as a human, maybe I could help others someday. A warm smile spread across Sarah's face. Of course. I'd be happy to teach you. What's your name? Puffles, the dust bunny replied. And so, as the rest of the class looked on in a mixture of horror and fascination, Sarah began to instruct Puffles in the basics of first aid. It was slow going. Puffles fainted at the mere mention of disinfectant, but it was a start. Professor Zyx'nax watched the scene unfold, his gelatinous form practically glowing with satisfaction. This, he thought, was why he became a teacher, to witness the moment when fear turned to curiosity, when the unknown became a challenge to be understood rather than a threat to be avoided. Of course, the fact that he'd managed to traumatize half his class in the process was just a bonus. As Sarah demonstrated how to properly apply a bandage to one of Puffles' many fuzzy appendages, a thought occurred to her. You know, Professor, maybe next time we could do a class on human sports. I think they'd love to learn about football. The professor's entire form shuddered with glee. Oh my human Sarah, I do believe you're trying to give my students a collective nervous breakdown. I heartily approve. Shall we schedule it for next week? Sarah grinned, her teeth glinting in the classroom's light. Half the students ducked under their desks again, but Puffles and a few others leaned in, eager to learn more about these fascinating, terrifying Deathworlders. Absolutely, Sarah said. I'll bring my old helmet and shoulder pads. It'll be a blast. As the professor began to plan the next lecture, already imagining the chaos that would ensue, Sarah turned back to her impromptu first aid class. Puffles was now proudly sporting a band-aid which, on the dust bunny's tiny form, looked more like a full body cast, and was excitedly explaining the concept to his classmates. And then the human applies this sticky healing strip, and it holds your very essence together while your body repairs itself, Puffles exclaimed, bouncing up and down in excitement. Sarah opened her mouth to correct the rather extreme interpretation but thought better of it. Sometimes a little mystery was a good thing. Besides, if it got the students interested in learning more about humans and first aid, a few exaggerations couldn't hurt. As the class wound down and the students began to file out, giving Sarah a wide berth as they did so, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Sure, it hadn't gone exactly as planned, but she'd managed to introduce these aliens to a fundamental aspect of human culture. And who knows, maybe someday one of them would use what they learned here to help someone in need. Professor Zyx'nax oozed over to her one last time. Thank you again. Human Sarah, this has been most illuminating and entertaining. mostly entertaining. Sarah laughed. Happy to help, Professor. Though I have to ask, why did you really invite me here today? Surely there were less dramatic ways to teach your students about alien species. The professor's form rippled in what Sarah had come to recognize as his version of a mischievous grin. My dear. What better way to teach the true nature of Deathworlders than to show how even your acts of kindness and healing seem like unimaginable brutality to the rest of the galaxy. Besides, he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I had credits writing on how many students would faint. Thanks to you, I've won the faculty betting pool. Sarah shook her head, chuckling. Some things, it seemed, were universal. Even in the depths of space, teachers would find a way to make their jobs more interesting. As she packed up her first aid kit, Sarah glanced around the classroom one last time. Most of the students had left, but a few lingered, watching her with a mixture of fear and fascination. Puffles was in the corner, proudly showing off his band-aid to a group of awestruck classmates. You know what, Professor, Sarah said, a smile playing on her lips. I think I'm going to enjoy teaching here. Same time next week. Professor Zyx'nax's entire form wiggled with delight. I wouldn't miss it for all the dark matter in the galaxy, my dear. Now, about that football demonstration. As Sarah left the classroom, already planning her next lecture, she couldn't help but laugh. Who would have thought that in a galaxy full of incredible alien species, it would be humanity's ability to stick a plaster on a cut that would prove the most shocking? But then again, that was the beauty of the universe. Just when you think you've seen it all, someone comes along and faints at the sight of a band-aid. And really, Sarah thought as she headed towards her next adventure, isn't that what makes life interesting? Somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, on a small, unassuming planet orbiting an unremarkable star, a class of alien students was still trying to process what they'd witnessed. Tales of the terrifying Deathworlder and her mystical first aid spread through the campus like wildfire, growing more outlandish with each retelling. By the end of the day, the story had evolved to the point where Sarah was said to have brought the entire class back from the brink of death, using nothing but a roll of gauze and sheer force of will. The fact that no one had actually been injured or in any real danger was conveniently overlooked. In his dormitory, Glorp the Squidlorp basked in his newfound fame, and then he told his wide-eyed roommates for the 13th time that evening, the human placed her hands upon me, channeling the very energy of her death world through her fingertips. I could feel my molecules vibrating, my very essence teetering on the edge of oblivion. His roommates gasped in awe, completely enraptured by the tale. The fact that Glorp's near-death experience had been nothing more than a simple CPR demonstration was lost in the excitement. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the library, Puffles the dust bunny was poring over a hastily procured book on human biology. The tiny alien's eyes widened with each turn of the page, a mix of horror and fascination evident in their fuzzy features. Bones Puffles whispered in disbelief. They have rocks inside their bodies, and they break. And then heal. The very concept was almost too much for the little dust bunny to handle. But instead of fainting as they had done multiple times during Sarah's lecture, Puffles felt a steely determination settle in their fluffy core. If humans can survive with rocks for scaffolding, then by the cosmic dust I can learn this first aid, Puffles declared to no one in particular, earning a stern shushing from the library's AI. Undeterred, Puffles continued their research, the glow of the holoscreen reflecting off their fuzzy form. They were determined to unravel the mysteries of human resilience, one terrifying fact at a time. In the faculty lounge, Professor Zyx'nax was holding court, regaling his colleagues with tales of the day's excitement. You should have seen it, he burbled, his gelatinous form quivering with mirth. When the human demonstrated the Heimlich maneuver, I thought poor Zlorbax was going to turn himself inside out in sheer panic. The other professors listened with a mixture of horror and fascination. Professor Kiex, a being composed entirely of sentient gas, puffed up indignantly. Really, Zyx'nax, Kiex huffed, his voice sounding like a leaky balloon. Don't you think it's a bit unethical to subject our students to such trauma? These Deathworlders are clearly too dangerous to be allowed on campus. Zyx'nax's form rippled in what passed for a dismissive wave. Oh, come now, Kiex, a little trauma is good for the developing mind. Besides, you're just upset because you lost the betting pool. Kiki's deflated slightly, grumbling something about rigged odds and unfair advantages of solid matter. Another professor, a crystalline being named Sparkle, chimed in. I must admit, I'm intrigued by these human medical practices. Do you think the Deathworlder would be willing to demonstrate some of their more advanced techniques? The room fell silent as the professors contemplated the possibilities. The silence was broken by the sound of Zyx'nax's laughter, a noise not unlike a jellyfish being put through a wood chipper. Oh, my dear colleagues, he chortled, you have no idea what you're asking for. But fear not. I've already scheduled another lecture for next week. The human is going to teach the class about something called football. The collective gasp that echoed through the faculty lounge could have sucked the air out of a small moon. Meanwhile, in her quarters on the other side of the campus, Sarah was preparing for her next lecture. She'd requisitioned a set of old football gear from the human embassy and was now trying to figure out how to explain the concept of a tackle without causing a mass extinction event. Okay, she muttered to herself, pacing back and forth. Maybe I can start with the basics. The ball, the field, the scoring system. Then gradually work up to the more physical aspects of the game. She picked up a football, tossing it from hand to hand as she thought. The gravity on this planet was slightly lower than Earth's, which meant she'd have to adjust her throws. Wouldn't want to accidentally launch the ball into orbit during a demonstration. A chime from her comm unit interrupted her musings. It was a message from Professor Zyx'nax. "My dear human Sarah," the message burbled, the professor's gelatinous face wobbling on the screen. "I hope this finds you well. I just wanted to inform you that news of your upcoming football lecture has spread throughout the campus. The xenobiology department has received an unprecedented number of requests to attend. We've had to book the grand auditorium to accommodate everyone. Oh, and the medical bay has been put on high alert just in case. No pressure. Looking forward to the excitement. Yours in anticipation, Zyx'nax." Sarah stared at the screen, a mix of amusement and trepidation washing over her. She'd expected some interest, but this was on a whole other level. "Well," she said to the empty room, a grin spreading across her face. "If they want a show, I'll give them a show." She began to pace again, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe she could recruit some of the braver students for a quick scrimmage, or set up a mock field and run some plays. The possibilities were endless. As she planned, Sarah couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, light years from Earth, about to introduce a bunch of aliens to one of humanity's most beloved and violent sports. If someone had told her a year ago that this would be her life, she'd have laughed them out of the room. But now she wouldn't have it any other way. The week leading up to Sarah's football lecture was one of mounting excitement and terror on campus. Rumors flew faster than photon torpedoes, each more outlandish than the last. "I heard the human is going to demonstrate how they hunt prey on their death world." No, it's a ritual combat to determine mating rights." "You're both wrong. It's clearly a simulation of their planet's gravity-crushingly dense atmosphere. Only the strongest survive." The truth, as usual, was far less dramatic but no less terrifying to the alien students. In the days leading up to the lecture, Sarah could be seen jogging around the campus, her feet pounding the ground in a rhythm that sent shivers through the more gelatinous species. She was simply trying to stay in shape, but to the watching aliens, it looked like a display of raw, terrifying power. Glorp, still riding high on his newfound fame, had taken to following Sarah around, peppering her with questions about human physiology and culture. "But why do you need to consume dihydrogen monoxide so frequently?" he asked one day, his tentacles waving in confusion. "Surely such a corrosive substance can't be good for you." Sarah, jogging in place to keep her heart rate up, tried not to laugh. "It's just water. Glorp were mostly made of it. It's essential for our survival." Glorp's eyes widened in horror. "You mean you're filled with acid? And it doesn't dissolve you from the inside out?" "Well, when you put it like that," Sarah trailed off, realizing that sometimes the truth was stranger than any alien fiction. As the day of the lecture approached, the campus was abuzz with anticipation. Students from all departments were clamoring for seats in the grand auditorium. Even some of the more adventurous faculty members had signed up to attend. Professor Zyx'nax was in his element, oozing from one end of the campus to the other, stoking the flames of excitement. He'd even set up a new betting pool, this time on how many students would faint during the demonstration. "Place your bets, colleagues," he burbled gleefully. "Will it be more or fewer than last time? Will someone spontaneously evolve a fight-or-flight response? The possibilities are endless." The night before the big day, Sarah sat in her quarters, surrounded by football equipment. She'd managed to set up a small holo projector to show footage of actual NFL games, hoping it would help illustrate the sport better than her clumsy explanations. As she watched the familiar plays unfold, a wave of homesickness washed over her. It had been months since she'd watched a real game, years since she'd played. For a moment, she wondered if this whole thing was a mistake. Maybe football was just too human for these aliens to understand. But then she remembered the look of wide-eyed fascination on Puffles' fuzzy face during the first aid demonstration, the way Glorp, despite his melodramatic retellings, had genuinely seemed interested in learning more about humans. Even Professor Zyx'nax, for all his mischievous glee, seemed genuinely excited about bridging the gap between their species. Sarah's resolve hardened. She'd come here to be an ambassador for humanity, hadn't she? To show these aliens that humans were more than just the terrifying Deathworlders they'd heard about in stories. And what better way to do that than through one of humanity's most beloved pastimes? With renewed determination, Sarah turned back to her preparations. Tomorrow, she'd show them what football was really about: the teamwork, the strategy, the sheer joy of the game. And if a few aliens fainted in the process, well, that was just part of the fun. As she packed up her gear for the night, Sarah couldn't help but grin. Tomorrow was going to be a day to remember for humans and aliens alike. Little did she know just how memorable it would be. The morning of the lecture dawned bright and early. Well, as bright and early as it could get on a planet with 3 suns and a 37-hour day cycle. Sarah was up with the first sun, going through her usual workout routine and mentally preparing for the day ahead. As she jogged towards the grand auditorium, she noticed the campus was unusually quiet. It wasn't until she rounded the corner and saw the massive crowd gathered outside the building that she realized why. It seemed like every student, professor, and staff member on campus had turned up for the lecture. The crowd was a writhing mass of tentacles, pseudopods, and appendages Sarah couldn't even begin to classify. She could have sworn she even saw a few bioluminescent beings floating above the crowd, their curious glow adding to the surreal scene. As Sarah approached, a hush fell over the assembled aliens. Then, as if on cue, they parted like the Red Sea, creating a path for her to the auditorium entrance. The silence was broken only by the occasional whimper of fear or gasp of awe. At the door, Sarah was met by a very excited, very wobbly Professor Zyx'nax. "Ah, human Sarah," he burbled, his gelatinous form quivering with barely contained glee. "Quite the turnout, wouldn't you say? I do believe we've broken the record for the most attended lecture in the university's history, and possibly the record for the most emergency medical personnel on standby, but who's counting?" Sarah grinned, her earlier nerves giving way to a rush of excitement. "Well, Professor, let's not keep them waiting, ready to make some history." "My dear Zyx'nax," rippled, "I've been ready since the moment you agreed to this madness. Shall we?" With that, they entered the auditorium. The sea of alien faces and other sensory organs that greeted them was a sight to behold. Sarah could see Glorp in the front row, already regaling his neighbors with exaggerated tales of his near-death experience from the last lecture. Puffles was there too, a comically large first aid kit clutched in their fuzzy appendages, ready for any eventuality. As Sarah made her way to the stage, she could hear the whispers and murmurs rippling through the crowd. "Look at how smoothly it moves on those rigid appendages. I heard it can accelerate to dangerous velocities in seconds. Is it true they have a skeleton inside their bodies?" Sarah bit back a laugh. If they were this worked up just watching her walk, she couldn't wait to see their reactions to actual football. As she reached the podium, Sarah took a deep breath and surveyed the crowd. Beings of all shapes, sizes, and states of matter looked back at her, a mix of fear and fascination evident in their various sensory organs. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice echoing through the auditorium. "Today we're going to talk about one of humanity's most beloved pastimes, football." A collective gasp ran through the audience. In the back, someone fainted with a soft poof. Sarah grinned. Oh yes, this was going to be fun. Now, before we get into the rules and gameplay, let's start with the basics. This, she held up the brown, oblong ball, is a football. The auditorium erupted into chaos. "It's a projectile weapon." "No, it's clearly some sort of egg." "You fools, it's obviously a primitive data storage device." Sarah waited for the commotion to die down, an amused smile playing on her lips. Once the noise had subsided to a dull roar, she continued, "It's actually just a ball. We throw it, catch it, and sometimes kick it. The objective of the game is to get this ball into the opponent's end zone to score points." She proceeded to explain the basic rules of the game, using the holo projector to show clips from various NFL games. With each new piece of information, the alien audience seemed to grow more confused and terrified. When Sarah explained the concept of tackling, she thought poor Glorp was going to liquefy on the spot. "You mean you intentionally collide with each other at high velocities?" For fun, the Squidlorp's voice was a high-pitched squeak of disbelief. Sarah nodded, trying to keep a straight face. "Yep, it's all part of the strategy. You try to stop the player with the ball from advancing." A gaseous entity in the third row expanded rapidly in shock, nearly engulfing its neighbors. But what about your fragile internal organs, your delicate bone structures?" "Oh, don't worry," Sarah reassured them, holding up her old football pads. "We wear protective gear." See, the sight of the pads, which to human eyes looked like fairly standard sports equipment, elicited another round of gasps and fainting spells from the audience. To them, it might as well have been battle armor from some apocalyptic war world. As Sarah continued her explanation, demonstrating various football moves and plays, she could see the alien students and faculty cycling through a range of emotions. Fear gave way to fascination, which in turn gave way to a sort of horrified admiration. Professor Zyx'nax, who had been observing from the side of the stage, was practically vibrating with excitement. Every new revelation about the sport seemed to send him into paroxysms of gelatinous glee. Finally, after what seemed like hours of explanation and numerous fainting spells, gasps of horror, and one incident where a crystalline being nearly shattered in shock, Sarah decided it was time for a practical demonstration. "All right," she said, clapping her hands together. The sound echoed through the auditorium like a thunderclap, causing several students to duck for cover. "Who wants to try throwing the football?" The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a photon drop. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a fuzzy appendage rose from the front row. I'll try," came the tiny, quavering voice of Puffles. A murmur of awe and respect rippled through the crowd. Puffles, the dust bunny who had fainted multiple times during the first aid lecture, was volunteering to handle the terrifying human projectile. As Puffles made their way to the stage, Sarah couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was what it was all about, breaking down barriers, fostering understanding between species, no matter how different they might be. She knelt down to Puffles' level, holding out the football. "Okay, Puffles, just grip it here, and when you're ready, throw it as hard as you can towards the target over there." She pointed to a large, cushioned target she'd set up at the other end of the stage. Puffles took the ball, their tiny fuzzy form almost comical next to the large brown oval. The dust bunny took a deep breath, wound up in what they clearly thought was an approximation of a Kunlun throwing stance, and let fly. What happened next would go down in university legend. The ball left Puffles' grip with surprising force, arcing through the air towards the target. But in the lower gravity of the alien world, combined with Puffles' unique physiology, the throw went much further than anyone anticipated. The football sailed over the target, over the edge of the stage, and directly towards the audience. Aliens scattered in panic, their various appendages flailing as they tried to avoid the incoming projectile. In the ensuing chaos, Professor Zyx'nax, in a moment of either incredible bravery or utter madness, launched himself into the air. His gelatinous form stretched and contorted as he reached for the ball. Time seemed to slow down. The entire auditorium watched in suspended disbelief as the professor's amorphous body wrapped around the football, absorbing its momentum and dropping safely to the ground with a loud splat. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a cheer went up. Soon, the entire auditorium was filled with alien sounds of approval and excitement. Professor Zyx'nax reformed himself, the football clutched triumphantly in a pseudopod. "I caught it," he burbled ecstatically. "I caught the human projectile." The crowd went wild. Students who had been cowering in fear moments ago were now clamoring to touch the football, to attempt a throw of their own. To learn more about this thrilling and terrifying human sport,